Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to break down what really happened after the Frontline broke, a moment that didn't just change a single battle, but reshaped the entire course of the conflict. When people talk about a Frontline collapse, they often imagine a sudden defeat, a dramatic retreat, or a single explosive event. But the truth is far more complex, far more human, and far more dangerous than that simple picture. At first, the collapse didn't even look like a collapse. On maps, the lines still existed. On paper, commands were still being issued. Units were still reporting positions. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had already cracked. Communication slowed, trust weakened, and decision-making became reactive instead of strategic. This was the silent beginning of the breakdown. Once the Frontline gave way, the most immediate consequence was confusion. Soldiers on the ground often had no clear idea of whether they were supposed to hold, retreat, or counterattack. Orders contradicted each other. Some units advanced while others pulled back, creating dangerous gaps that were never meant to exist. In war, uncertainty spreads faster than fear, and once it takes hold, it is incredibly difficult to control. Supply chains were among the first systems to fail. Ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies rely on stable front lines to move safely. When the line broke, convoys suddenly found themselves exposed. Routes that were secure hours earlier became deadly traps. Trucks were abandoned. Depots were overrun or destroyed. Soldiers began rationing, not because resources didn't exist, but because they could no longer reach the people who needed them. Morale suffered almost immediately. Soldiers are trained to fight under pressure, but they rely on structure and purpose. When the Frontline collapsed, many fighters felt isolated, cut off, and forgotten. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed reinforcements were coming. Others believed the war was already lost. In this mental fog, discipline weakened, and cohesion began to dissolve. Commanders faced impossible choices. Holding ground risked encirclement and annihilation. Retreating risked turning an organized force into a fleeing one. Every decision carried consequences that could not be reversed. In many cases, commanders had to act with incomplete information, knowing that a single wrong move could cost thousands of lives. As the collapse widened, the enemy exploited it with speed and precision. Breakthroughs are not valuable unless they are used, and once the Frontline broke, mobile units pushed deep into previously secure territory. Key intersections, bridges, and high ground were seized before defenses could be reorganized. What started as a crack became a widening fracture. Civilians were pulled into the chaos almost instantly. Towns near the former Frontline suddenly found themselves unprotected. Evacuations were rushed or impossible. Roads clogged with families fleeing in panic. Infrastructure that once supported daily life became targets or obstacles. Hospitals overflowed. Power and water systems failed. The collapse of a Frontline is never purely military. It is a humanitarian disaster unfolding in real time. One of the most damaging effects was the loss of intelligence. Observation posts were abandoned. Surveillance systems went offline. Recon units were cut off or forced to withdraw. Without accurate information, commanders were effectively blind. Decisions were made based on outdated reports, assumptions, or worst case fears. This lack of clarity amplified every other problem. Inside the collapsing force, blame began to spread. Some accused leadership of incompetence. Others blamed poor equipment or lack of support. These internal divisions weakened any remaining unity. Instead of focusing entirely on stabilizing the situation, energy was wasted on defending reputations and shifting responsibility. Attempts to re-establish a defensive line were made, but they were rushed and fragile. New positions lacked proper fortifications. Units that had never fought together were suddenly combined. Coordination suffered. These improvised lines might slow an advance, but they rarely stop it completely. Each fallback position became another temporary barrier rather than a true solution. The psychological impact of the collapse extended far beyond the battlefield. News of the breakthrough spread rapidly through media and social networks. Supporters at home began to question the narrative they had been told for months or years. Confidence in victory weakened. International observers reassessed their positions, alliances, and predictions. Allies watching the collapse faced difficult decisions. Some increased support to prevent total defeat. Others hesitated, fearing deeper involvement in a losing cause. Aid that once flowed steadily became conditional or delayed. In modern conflicts, perception matters almost as much as reality, and a broken front line sends a powerful message to the world. For the opposing side, the collapse was both an opportunity and a risk. Advancing too fast could overstretch forces and expose them to counterattacks. Advancing too slowly could allow defenses to regroup. Balancing aggression with caution became critical. Success depended not just on strength, but on discipline and coordination. As days passed, the initial shock turned into exhaustion. Soldiers who had been fighting nonstop, without rest or resupply, reached physical and mental limits. Equipment broke down faster than it could be repaired. Casualties mounted not only from combat, but from stress, dehydration, and untreated injuries. The collapse created conditions where even survival became a challenge. Behind the scenes, emergency plans were activated. Reserves were rushed forward. New command structures were proposed. Old strategies were abandoned, but rebuilding order after chaos is far harder than maintaining it in the first place. Every hour lost during the collapse made recovery more difficult. The frontline break also exposed long-standing weaknesses that had been ignored. Training gaps, outdated doctrine, overconfidence, and political interference all came into focus. What looked like a sudden failure was often the result of months or years of accumulated problems finally reaching a breaking point. In some areas, local commanders managed to stabilize the situation through decisive action. They consolidated forces, restored communication, and established limited defensive successes. These moments proved that collapse was not inevitable everywhere, but isolated successes could not fully reverse the overall momentum. As the conflict entered this new phase, objectives shifted. Instead of advancing or holding territory, the priority became survival and preservation of remaining forces. Strategic goals were scaled back. What once aimed for victory now aimed to avoid total defeat. This psychological shift marked a profound turning point. The human cost continued to rise. Families waited for news that never came. Prisoners were taken. The wounded were left behind during chaotic retreats. These stories rarely appear on maps or in briefings, but they define what a frontline collapse truly means on a personal level. Over time, the collapse reshaped negotiations and diplomacy. Positions that were once non-negotiable suddenly became flexible. Offers that were previously rejected were reconsidered. Power dynamics shifted at the table just as they had on the battlefield. Looking back, analysts often search for the exact moment when everything went wrong. Was it a single decision, a single battle, or a single mistake? In reality, the frontline broke because multiple failures converged at the same time. Leadership, logistics, morale, intelligence, and timing all failed together. What really happened after the frontline broke was not just a military setback. It was a cascading failure that affected every layer of the conflict. From soldiers in trenches to civilians in cities, from commanders in bunkers to politicians in distant capitals, everyone felt the consequences. The lesson is clear but often ignored. Front lines do not collapse only because of enemy strength. They collapse when internal systems can no longer support the pressure placed upon them. When trust erodes, when preparation falls short, and when reality is ignored for too long, even the strongest line will eventually give way. As the conflict continues to evolve, the effects of that moment still shape decisions, movements, and outcomes. The front line may be redrawn, but the impact of its collapse lingers. It changes how wars are fought, how they are understood, and how they are remembered. And that is what really happened after the front line broke. Not just a line on a map moving backward, but an entire system unraveling under the weight of its own weaknesses, leaving consequences that will be felt long after the fighting itself moves on.